The knock came once, sharp and deliberate, and Eli Mercer stopped breathing because nothing honest ever arrived at a ranch door at midnight unless it was running from something faster than fear. He stayed still, counting the ticks in the stove and the wind sliding along the boards, listening for the scrape of boots or the whisper of voices beyond the porch. And when the knock came again, softer, careful, practiced, he understood whoever stood there had learned how to ask without being heard. He did not light the lantern. Light told stories to the dark, and the dark was always listening. He stepped to the door and heard it then, the smallest sound pushed thin by cold, a child's breath muffled by cloth, and the sound reached him like a hand on the chest, because children didn't choose midnight unless someone else chose it for them. He opened the door a finger's width and saw her standing close enough to block the wind, shoulders rounded as if she had learned to make herself smaller, eyes lifted to his without pleading, and in her arms a boy slept too deeply for the hour, cheek pressed to her coat, like sleep was the last place no one could take him from. She didn't explain. She didn't look past him. She said please as if it were a statement rather than a request. And the restraint in her voice told Eli more than any story could, because people who expect mercy ask for it, and people who expect refusal brace for the blow. He felt the pull to scan the yard, to mark the fence line and the road and the space between, to read the night for riders or movement. But the child shifted and made that same thin sound again, and Eli understood that whatever danger existed had already chosen its shape. He stepped back and opened the door wider without naming the choice, and the woman hesitated just long enough for him to see the bruising at her wrist, a pale band that spoke of a grip that had not let go when it should have. She crossed the threshold quickly, eyes flicking once toward the dark as if expecting it to follow, and Eli closed the door with care. Not to hide them, but to slow the world down enough to see what had arrived. Warmth reached the child, and his fingers tightened in her coat, and Eli felt the room change as if a line had been crossed that couldn't be stepped back over. He hadn't asked where they came from or why midnight had been the hour left to them, and she hadn't offered. And the silence between them filled with everything not yet said as the stove cracked and the boards settled and the wind tested the walls. Eli took in the way she stood between him and the boy without meaning to, the way she angled her body as if the room itself might turn hostile, and he knew then that letting them in was not the end of the danger, but the moment it learned exactly where to come. He set the latch gently and turned, already listening past the fire and the walls, because the knock had never been a request at all. It had been a warning, and whatever drove a woman to a ranch door with a sleeping child did not stop at doors once it knew where they were. Eli did not ask her to sit because sitting felt like staying, and staying carried weight he wasn't ready to name. So he moved instead, setting the kettle on the stove and placing himself where he could see the door, the window, and the woman all at once, the habit of watchfulness settling in as naturally as breath. She remained standing, shifting the child higher against her shoulder, eyes tracking his hands rather than his face, and Eli recognized the calculation immediately, the way people learned to read what might hurt them before they learned what might help. The boy stirred again, letting out a small sound that tightened Eli's jaw, because it was the kind of noise you made when sleep was fighting pain. And the woman pressed her cheek briefly to his hair, as if counting heartbeats. "He's warm," Eli said quietly, not a question, and she nodded once, relief flickering and vanishing as if she didn't trust it to stay. Eli poured water into a chipped cup and set it on the table without pushing it toward her, leaving the choice intact, and that small restraint shifted something in the room because it made the space feel less like a test. She drank carefully, keeping one arm locked around the boy, and Eli noticed how she positioned herself with her back to the wall, never fully turning away from the door, as if escape and defense had become the same motion. Outside, the wind dragged along the fence, and the sound made her flinch, and Eli followed her eyes to the window, seeing nothing but dark and knowing that meant very little. He asked her name then, because names anchored people to places, and he needed to know who had crossed his threshold. And she answered after a pause that felt measured rather than hesitant, telling him she was Clara, and that the boy was Thomas, her voice steady only because she forced it to be. Eli nodded, filing the names where they could not be easily misplaced, and asked how far they had walked, and she answered truthfully enough to tell him it had been too far, her gaze dropping to the floor when he asked from where. He did not press, because answers given under pressure often carried the shape of whatever threat was nearest, and he could see the threat still lived close to her skin. The kettle began to sing, and Eli took it off the heat, pouring slowly, listening between sounds for anything that didn't belong. And when he returned to the table, he found Clara watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Not because it was bold, but because it was hopeful. "They won't knock again," she said quietly, not looking at the door, and the certainty in her voice made Eli still, because it meant she knew something he didn't. He asked who they were, keeping his tone even, and Clara shook her head once, a small refusal that felt less like secrecy and more like protection. The boy coughed softly, the sound thin and wrong, and Eli felt the shape of the night change because sickness complicated everything it touched. He crossed to the cupboard for a blanket and draped it gently over the child, careful not to startle him. And as his hand brushed the boy's back, he felt how hot it was, and understood then that waiting was no longer an option, because danger had followed them inside, and time had chosen its side. He straightened slowly, eyes back on the door, and realized the silence beyond it was not empty at all. It was listening, and whatever Clara believed would not knock again had already found another way to announce itself. The rancher waited until Clara's breathing slowed, and Thomas's small chest rose and fell in a rhythm that meant sleep had won another brief argument. Then he lifted the lantern just enough to cut a narrow path of light and stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him with care because noise traveled farther than truth at night. The cold hit his face hard and clean, and he stood still for a count, letting his eyes adjust, listening past the wind and the creak of wood for anything that didn't fit the land he knew. And when he saw the marks near the gate, his jaw tightened because they were too fresh and too deliberate to belong to chance. Bootprints cut across the dirt at an angle no ranch hand would take, the heel marks deep as if the men wearing them hadn't bothered to slow, and Eli followed them a few steps farther than he should have, far enough to see where they stopped and turned back, close enough to the house to measure the distance without stepping into the light. He straightened and scanned the fence line, noting where the wire had been pressed down and lifted again, the kind of careful damage done by people who expected to return, and the realization settled heavy because it meant Clara had not outrun trouble. She had delayed it. He went back inside without the lantern this time, letting darkness cover his movement, and latched the door with a sound soft enough to be missed, his mind already turning through what he had and what he didn't, counting ammunition without touching it, planning exits without committing to them. Clara looked up as he entered, eyes sharp despite exhaustion, and the fact that she had not slept told him everything he needed to know about how long fear could keep a person awake. They followed, he said quietly, choosing honesty because lies broke faster than doors, and Clara nodded once, as if confirmation hurt less than surprise, her grip tightening around Thomas until the boy stirred and whimpered. Eli moved to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to check the yard again, the land giving back nothing but darkness, and he understood the waiting now, the way predators let the night do half their work. He asked her then why they were being followed, not demanding and not urgent. And Clara's answer came slow, words weighed and discarded until she said only that Thomas was not meant to exist where he came from. And the sentence chilled him because it spoke of decisions made by people who did not expect resistance. Eli leaned against the table and felt the house settle around them, wood and stone and habit holding its breath. And he realized the ranch was no longer neutral ground. It was a marker on someone else's map. A sound carried from beyond the fence then, not loud enough to place but close enough to feel. And Clara went still, eyes fixed on the door as if it might move on its own. And Eli understood the silence had finally chosen a side. He lowered the lantern until the flame dimmed and motioned her toward the back room without speaking. Not because he planned to hide, but because the first rule of keeping people alive was buying time without announcing it. As they moved, Eli felt the night press closer, the waiting tighten, and he knew the tracks outside were not a warning meant to scare them away. They were a promise, and whatever had come for Clara and Thomas was patient enough to circle until morning, unless Eli decided to change the shape of the night before it did. Eli moved them through the house the way he moved through bad weather, without haste and without apology, because speed drew attention, and attention turned into mistakes. And as he guided Clara toward the back room, he felt the weight of the choice settle into his shoulders with a familiarity he hadn't wanted to feel again. He set Thomas down on the narrow bed, and the boy whimpered softly, heat rolling off him in waves that made Eli's jaw tighten because sickness narrowed time into something sharp and unforgiving. Clara hovered, torn between staying close and staying quiet, and Eli caught her eye long enough to make a small downward motion with his hand, the signal he used with nervous horses when he needed calm more than obedience. He checked the back window and the yard beyond it, noting how the moonlight cut the fence line and left pockets of darkness wide enough to hide intent. And he felt the plan forming, not because he wanted trouble, but because trouble had already made its move. He returned to the main room and took down the rifle, not loading it yet, letting the weight of it remind him of the cost before he decided to pay it. And he set it by the door where it could be reached without being displayed. The house creaked as if answering a question no one had spoken, and Eli listened, counting the seconds between sounds, mapping the night in his head the way he had learned to do when survival depended on knowing where you stood. Clara followed him quietly, her voice low when she finally spoke, telling him she didn't expect him to do this, whatever this had become, and Eli shook his head once because expectation had nothing to do with it anymore. He asked how many men there were, not because he planned to fight them all, but because numbers changed the shape of every choice. And Clara hesitated before saying 2 for certain, and maybe a third who stayed back, and the honesty in her uncertainty mattered more than precision. A sound brushed the fence again, closer now, deliberate enough to be heard by someone listening for it, and Eli felt the night tighten like a rope pulled slow, the kind that didn't break skin but still cut. He extinguished the lantern completely and let the dark take the room, trusting his memory of the space more than light that could betray them, and he motioned Clara back to the bed, placing himself between her and the door without touching either. His mind ran through options he didn't like, waiting, running, speaking, and discarded them one by one because each carried a cost he wasn't willing to pay, until only one remained that fit the land and the hour. He stepped to the door and rested his hand on the latch, not opening it yet, listening to the breathing inside the house and the quieter breathing outside. And he understood then that letting Clara and Thomas in had not been the brave choice or the foolish one. It had been the necessary one, because the men beyond the fence were counting on fear and movement, and Eli intended to give them neither. He drew a slow breath and squared his stance, ready to meet whatever came without giving it the satisfaction of surprise, knowing that once the door opened, the night would stop waiting and start choosing, and the choice he made in the next few seconds would decide whether this ranch became a refuge or a marker on a map where mercy had finally learned how much it cost. He opened the door just enough to let the night see him, and no more, standing square in the frame with his shoulders relaxed and his hands empty, because men who expected fear often mistook calm for permission. The yard lay still under thin moonlight, the fence line dark where it dipped and rose, and then shapes separated themselves from the shadows, the way intention always did when it thought it was unseen. 2 men stood near the gate, hats low, coats drawn tight, their posture loose in the practiced way of people who believed they had already won. And Eli felt the truth settle, because confidence like that didn't come from guessing. One of them stepped forward a pace, boots crunching deliberately on gravel to announce control, and called Eli by name. The sound of it wrong in the open air because no one used your name, unless they believed it belonged to them. Eli didn't answer, letting the silence stretch long enough to force the next move. And the man smiled as if amused, explaining that they were looking for a woman and a child who had lost their way, that there had been a misunderstanding, that it would be easier for everyone if Eli didn't complicate things. The words were chosen carefully, gentle enough to sound reasonable, sharp enough to warn. And Eli recognized the pattern because it was the same one used by people who preferred compliance to blood. He asked how they knew where to look, keeping his voice even, and the smile faltered just enough to betray irritation, before the man shrugged and said towns talked, roads remembered, and children made noise, and the casualness of it tightened Eli's grip on the doorframe because it reduced pursuit to inevitability. The second man shifted, scanning the windows as if measuring distance, and Eli understood then that negotiation was a performance meant to keep him still while they took inventory. He told them the ranch wasn't a crossroads, and that whoever they were looking for wasn't there, and the lie felt solid because it had been earned by choice rather than convenience. The first man's tone cooled, reminding Eli that helping runaways carried consequences, that sickness complicated things, that the boy would not last long without proper care, and the threat slid home because it used concern as leverage. Eli felt anger rise and set it aside because anger hurried decisions, and he needed time. And he asked who sent them, not because he expected an answer, but because questions forced men to reveal how much they believed their own authority. The man laughed softly and said no one needed to be sent when things were simply being returned. And Eli felt the night sharpen because the word returned carried ownership without apology. A sound came from inside then, small and involuntary, Thomas shifting in his sleep, and the man's head turned slightly, eyes narrowing, and Eli knew the moment had tipped because proof had arrived uninvited. He stepped fully into the doorway, widening his stance, and told them to leave, not loudly and not twice, and the stillness that followed felt heavier than any threat spoken aloud. The men exchanged a look, calculation passing between them, and the first man nodded once as if filing the ranch away for later, saying they would come back at daylight with help and paperwork and the kind of authority that didn't knock. And as they backed toward the gate without turning their backs, Eli understood the truth of it, that the night had only been the beginning. He watched them disappear into the dark and closed the door slowly, the sound final and careful, because daylight promised something worse than shadows. And as he turned back toward Clara and the child, he knew the next choice would not be about keeping the door shut, but about deciding how far he was willing to go to make sure it never opened for them again. Eli did not sleep after the men left because sleep belonged to people who believed morning would solve things, and he had learned the hard way that daylight only made intentions clearer. He banked the fire low and sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a tin cup that had gone cold, listening to the house breathe and to the softer sounds beyond it, the land settling into the hours before dawn when decisions either hardened or fell apart. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, with Thomas curled against her, one hand pressed to his back, as if she could will the heat out of him. And Eli felt the urgency sharpen, because sickness did not wait for plans to be finished. He told her quietly what the men had said, not sparing detail and not adding fear, and Clara closed her eyes for a moment, as if bracing against a memory she had hoped not to reopen. She said the word daylight, like a warning, explaining that paperwork meant the town, and the town meant names that turned into doors that only opened one way. And Eli understood then that staying put was no longer neutral. It was an invitation. He walked the length of the house and back again, counting steps, mapping exits, measuring what could be carried without slowing them down, and every option he weighed carried the same cost. Movement would expose them, waiting would concentrate the threat. The only path that made sense ran through land most men avoided, a cut of ravine and scrub that twisted north toward the river, rough enough to erase tracks and slow pursuit, but hard on the healthy and dangerous for a child burning with fever. Eli knelt by the bed and checked Thomas's breathing, steady but shallow, and felt the boy's heat through his palm, and the choice settled into place because some risks could be measured, and others could not. He told Clara they would leave before first light, not toward town, and not along the road, and Clara nodded without argument because agreement did not require understanding when the alternative was worse. She asked where they would go, and Eli told her only that there were places the law did not hurry to reach, and the truth of it felt both like shelter and like exile. He packed quickly and lightly, food enough for a day, water wrapped against the cold, medicine he kept for animals because it was all he had, and he felt the weight of every item because carrying too much meant arriving too late. Outside, the wind shifted and the house creaked, and Eli paused with his hand on the door, listening for the sound of returning boots that did not come, and the absence of it felt deliberate, like a held breath. Clara wrapped Thomas tighter and stood, her movements careful and practiced, and Eli saw in her the shape of someone who had learned to travel without being remembered. He opened the door and let the dark back in, guiding them out without light, trusting the land he knew better than any map. And as they stepped away from the ranch, he felt a pull in his chest that surprised him. Not regret, but resolve, because leaving meant surrendering the comfort of familiarity for the honesty of risk. He closed the gate behind them without latching it, a small act that felt like erasing a line he might never cross again. And as they moved into the ravine, and the first thin line of dawn began to cut the sky, Eli understood the plan would cost more than silence ever had. But silence was no longer an option that kept anyone alive. The ravine took them quickly and without kindness, its walls closing in as if the land itself were deciding whether to allow passage. And Eli moved ahead with careful confidence, choosing each step for stability rather than speed, because haste here would cost skin and bone they couldn't afford to lose. Clara followed close, breath measured, Thomas wrapped tight against her chest, his heat a constant reminder that time was not on their side, and the narrow path forced them into a single file that erased their outline even as it demanded silence. Dawn crept higher, thin and gray, revealing scrub and stone slick with frost, and Eli felt the land resist them in small ways, loose gravel sliding underfoot, thorn-catching fabric, the kind of obstacles that punished impatience more than fear. They paused where the ravine widened just enough to let the river's sound reach them, water moving fast and cold, and Eli checked Thomas again, feeling the boy's pulse flutter and steady, and the relief was brief because relief never lasted when sickness traveled with you. Clara whispered that he had been like this before, that it passed if they could keep moving, and Eli heard the hope threaded through the certainty, the way people learned to promise themselves survival in manageable pieces. A crack sounded above them, stone shifting where it shouldn't, and Eli went still, lifting a hand, listening as the echo died and left behind something worse, the sense of being counted, He scanned the rim and caught a glimpse of movement too controlled to be chance, a shape pulling back just out of sight. And he knew then the men had chosen daylight for a reason, trusting the land to funnel what they couldn't corner at night. He changed direction without discussion, cutting across the slope where the ravine narrowed again, knowing it would cost them effort, but by uncertainty. And Clara followed without question, her trust a weight he felt keenly because it left no room for error. The river came into full view then, fast and swollen, its banks steep and treacherous, and Eli felt the choice compress because crossing would erase tracks but steal strength, and strength was already being rationed. He tested the edge with his boot, feeling the pull of the current tug at stone, and weighed the distance to the opposite bank, the angle of entry, the cost to a fevered child, and the calculation tightened until it hurt. Another sound came from above, clearer now, a shout cut short by distance, and Eli felt the ground refuse them patience, forcing a decision sooner than he wanted. He turned to Clara and told her to hold Thomas high and tight, not explaining beyond that because explanation wasted breath, and he stepped into the water first, the cold biting hard enough to steal air from his lungs. The current shoved at his legs and he braced, finding footing by memory and instinct, and when he reached back for Clara he saw fear flash and settle into resolve as she followed, the river seizing at her boots and trying to claim what it could. They moved together, inch by inch, Eli anchoring them where he could, and the crossing felt endless because every step carried the weight of what would happen if they slipped. When they reached the far bank, Eli hauled them up and out, hands numb, heart pounding, and he did not look back until they were clear of the water, because looking back invited doubt. From the trees beyond the bank, he heard voices rise in frustration, the river stealing their path and their certainty, and Eli knew they had bought time, not safety, and as Thomas coughed weakly against Clara's shoulder and the sky brightened, he understood the ground had refused them once but relented just enough to demand more, and whatever lay ahead would test whether time was something they could still afford to spend. They climbed until the river's roar dulled behind them and the trees thickened into a stand Eli had avoided for years, not because it was dangerous but because it remembered him, and places that remembered asked for payment eventually. The air grew colder beneath the canopy, light breaking into uneven patches that made distance hard to judge, and Eli felt the land shift from resistance to scrutiny, as if it were deciding whether to claim them or let them pass. He led them to a low cut in the rock half hidden by brush, a narrow opening that looked like nothing until you knew to see it, and Clara hesitated only a second before trusting him again, stepping into the shadow with Thomas pressed tight, the boy's breath coming in short, hot pulls that tightened Eli's chest. Inside, the ground leveled and the wind fell away, the space opening just enough to kneel without scraping skin, and Eli banked a small fire where smoke would be swallowed by stone, the old trick working as it always had. He wrapped Thomas in dry cloth and pressed medicine against the boy's gums, watching for the swallow, counting the seconds until the fever broke or rose, and the waiting felt heavier than the chase, because outcomes hid themselves better in stillness. Clara asked how long they could stay, and Eli told her not long, because hiding places became traps once people expected you to use them, and he listened past the drip of water for the sound of men who believed persistence was a substitute for patience. Outside, voices passed and returned, circling without finding the seam in the rock, and Eli felt the thin edge of relief because it meant the place still did its job, even as it demanded memory in return. Thomas's breathing eased a fraction, and Eli held the moment lightly, knowing fractions were all they had left, and when the boy finally slept deeper, Clara's shoulders sagged as if she had been holding the night upright by will alone. Eli stood at the mouth of the cut and watched light move across the trees, mapping the hours, and he understood the men would not stop. That daylight gave them confidence, and paper would give them cover, and the thought sharpened into resolve, because waiting here only delayed the same reckoning. He returned inside and told Clara they would move again before the sun dropped, not back toward the road and not farther into the hills, but toward a place where questions took longer to form than answers. And Clara nodded because she had learned the shape of survival did not include certainty. As he packed, Eli felt the old weight settle, the one he carried when he chose to act rather than endure, and he knew the place he had never used had given them more than shelter. It had given him time to decide what he was willing to lose, and as he stamped out the fire, and the smoke vanished into stone, he understood the next move would not be about escape at all. It would be about ending the chase in a way that could not be rewritten by daylight. They moved at dusk, when shadows grew long enough to lie convincingly, Eli choosing a line that cut across open ground just long enough to be seen, and then vanished again, because sometimes the fastest way to end a chase was to let it believe it was winning. Clara followed without speaking, Thomas lighter against her now. The fever dulled but not gone, and Eli felt the risk sharpen because hope often tempted people to hurry when patience still mattered. The land opened into a stretch of hardpan and scattered grass where tracks showed clearly, and Eli did not bother to hide them, placing his boots with intention, letting the story form the way the men expected it to, straight and desperate and leading toward the road. He heard voices rise behind them sooner than he wanted. The sound of confidence carried on the cooling air, and he angled them toward a line of cottonwoods where the ground broke suddenly, and the earth fell away into a shallow cut no one noticed until they were already inside it. They dropped down and waited. Breath held, and the men passed above them with curses and hurried steps, boots drumming past close enough that Eli could count them, and he felt the truth settle because there were 3 now, just as Clara had feared. When the voices moved on, Eli did not follow. He turned instead and led them the opposite way, back toward the place daylight would expose, because endings required witnesses even when justice did not. The lights of a small crossing came into view. Lanterns hung low where wagons stopped to water and trade words, and Eli felt the danger shift because this place belonged to no one long enough to control it. Clara hesitated, sensing the change, and Eli told her quietly that running forever taught people they were right to chase you, and she understood because she had learned the same lesson the hard way. As they stepped into the edge of the light, the men appeared again at the far end, surprised and irritated to find their quarry where stories gathered, and Eli saw the calculation flare as they weighed force against consequence. He did not raise his voice or his hands. He asked one question instead, clear enough for the onlookers to hear, asking who exactly had sent them to claim a sick child at gunpoint. And the question landed wrong because it demanded a name rather than obedience. The men answered with threats that sounded thin now, and the people at the crossing slowed, attention drawn not by drama but by the shape of it. A man standing still with a woman and a child who could barely keep his head up. Eli repeated the question, adding details he knew would stick. Dates, places, promises made behind doors, and the confidence drained from the men's posture because lies faltered when they had to travel in daylight. One of them cursed and reached for authority that wasn't there, and another glanced toward the road as if expecting reinforcement that did not come, and Eli felt the balance tip because the chase had finally been forced to explain itself. Clara shifted Thomas higher and spoke then, her voice quiet and steady, telling the truth without ornament, naming what had been taken and why, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than accusation because it left nothing to argue with. The men backed away a step, then another, anger cooling into calculation, and Eli understood they would leave not because they were defeated, but because they had been seen. And as the crossing swallowed their retreat and questions rippled outward, he knew the story would not end cleanly. but it would no longer belong to the people who had tried to write it in the dark. The crossing did not erupt after the men left. It absorbed the moment the way places of passage always did, turning it into questions that traveled faster than certainty. And Eli felt the release settle slow and uneven, because endings that depended on witnesses never arrived all at once. He stayed where he was until the lanterns burned lower, answering only what he had to, letting Clara speak when the truth belonged to her, and watching how the crowd shifted once it understood there would be no spectacle to satisfy curiosity. A wagoner offered water, a woman pressed a cloth into Clara's hands for Thomas's forehead, and the small acts mattered because they did not ask for explanations, and Eli felt the tension drain just enough to know the chase had lost its shape. By the time they moved on, the road felt different, less like a line to be followed, and more like a choice that could branch. And Eli walked with them as far as the trees where the light thinned again, not because he planned to continue, but because leaving people alone too quickly could feel like abandonment. Clara thanked him there without ceremony, and Eli nodded, accepting the thanks without claiming more than he had done, because the cost of help did not need to be collected from those who paid it already. He watched as she turned down a path that led away from town and law and into work that did not require permission. Thomas asleep against her shoulder now in a way that promised recovery, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of a problem moved into a future where it could be lived with rather than hunted. When Eli turned back toward his ranch, the night felt thinner, not safer, but honest, and he understood the door he had opened had changed the shape of his land, making it a place where refusal meant something and acceptance carried weight. He reached the porch as dawn began to gray the sky and paused with his hand on the latch, listening for a knock that did not come, and when he stepped inside, he closed the door firmly behind him, not out of fear, but with intention, because some doors were meant to be opened once, and others were meant to be closed so the world would learn where it stood. If this story stayed with you, like it, share it, and subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for quiet stories of love, redemption, and survival.